This video is sponsored by you, the amazing viewer who's kept us going for the last 3 years. When you look at the list of presidents in each country since the year 1960, it starts to strike you that there is something off about African elections. Since the year 1960, the US has had as many as 15 presidents, that is if we include the latest president, Joe Biden. The UK has had 13 prime ministers, while France has had 10 presidents, and even India has had 14 presidents. Looking at many sub-Saharan African countries on the other hand, these numbers are way lower. Cameroon has only had 2 presidents, with the current president Paul Biya having served for 36 years to date since the year 1984. Uganda has had 9 presidents, but their current president, Yoweri Museveni, has been in the throne for 34 years since 1986. Tanzania as well has only had 5 presidents, with their first president, Julius Nyerere, having served for 21 years, from the year 1964 to 1985. Kenya is also not left behind, having had 4 presidents, with the second president, Daniel Moi, having served for 24 years, from 1978 to the year 2002. Zimbabwe, as the last country that we'll focus on, has had 3 presidents, with Robert Mugabe, the immediate previous president, having served the country for 29 years, from 1987 till when he was overthrown via a military coup in the year 2017. These numbers, as shocking as they are, point to a central concern about how elections and in general democracy and inclusivity is run in Africa. Peaceful elections, especially those that foster democracy, are central pillars to growth and ending poverty in Africa. Please make sure to watch our previous video on how to end poverty in Africa, touching on the importance of credible and authentic leadership in ending the issue of poverty across many countries in Africa. And hey, before we continue, can I ask you that you please subscribe to our channel and feel free to leave us a comment with your thoughts on this video and any suggestions that you may have for future videos that you may want us to do. Let's start off by appreciating that many African countries have come a long way in political reforms. And in several countries such as Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Zambia, Rwanda, and Senegal, elections have been conducted largely peacefully in the recent past. That said, there have been many cases of pre- and post-election violence that have threatened democracy in Africa. A good example is Togo and Ethiopia in 2005, Zimbabwe in 2008, Kenya both in 2007 and 2017, and lastly Nigeria in the year 2007 and again in 2011. These though are just but a few of the many cases of prolonged civil wars, conflict, and violence that sub-Saharan countries have faced due to the flawed conduct of elections. So let's try and understand what hinders African elections from being peaceful. To understand why African elections are marred by problems and issues, it is important to look at the past of African leaders. Most of the African countries were colonized, and after gaining independence, the initial leaders needed to secure their seats and therefore proposed amendments to their constitution to allow for additional terms in office. This happened a lot, especially in the early 2000s, where the terms of many of these past colonial leaders were coming to an end. Since the year 2000, almost 20 heads of state across many African countries have remained in power through constitutional amendments. This includes Lassana Conte of Guinea back in 2001, Sam Nujoma of Namibia back in 1998, and the President of Togo back in 2002. Other countries have also had such constitutional amendments, including countries like Angola, Burundi, Cameroon, Djibouti, Chad, Guinea, Nigeria, Rwanda, Sudan, and Uganda. Though the main reason why these political incumbents sought to extend their terms remains largely in discussion, many studies show that the key incentive was protecting their wealth. Majority of the leaders believed that they would lose their wealth if they lost their power. They would also face prosecution for a lot of issues of corruption and human rights when they lost their positions of power. A good example is in Angola, where Dos Santos had faced many allegations of corruption and misuse of public funds, and his daughter Isabel was part of the scandals, having been the richest woman in Africa and the head of the country's oil company. Later, when Angola got a new head of state, state prosecutors charged Isabel with embezzlement and money laundering when it was found that she had used her father's position as the head of state to amass over $2 billion in wealth. Aside from the issue of losing their wealth, the other issue is that African presidents wanted to stay in power because there was no pension or retirement scheme for former presidents and heads of state. This would mean that once they are out of power, they would simply be out of money. There are also other reasons for election-related violence across the African continent. These include the fact that there are often weak election management bodies, flawed registers of the electorate, and generally a lack of transparency in the election process. This has often been the reason why bodies such as the European Union, the United Nations, and the African Union usually send observers to promote peace before, during, and after elections. Extending of presidential and other leadership limits is not a uniquely African issue. For example, in Russia, President Vladimir Putin has played musical chairs for many years by switching between the roles of president and prime minister in order to avoid term limits. South Korea and Brazil's head of states have also recently been heard discussing extending their terms through constitutional reforms. The interesting thing is that many European countries actually have no term limits for their heads of state. This is quite interesting when you look at the fact that many African leaders actually fight to extend their stay in power for their own benefit. There is no single reason why European countries do not have term limits for their heads of state. However, some studies attribute this to the fact that in many countries, these positions are simply ceremonial and not as a result of elections. Furthermore, in many of these countries, it is quite easy to overthrow a leader through a majority parliament vote. Therefore, term limits are not necessarily important in order to change leadership. So how can we end election-related violence in Africa? To end election-related violence in the African continent, it would be important to address each of these threats to election peace in Africa. One of the solutions is using technology, especially in voter registration and authentication. In some African countries, notably Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, the use of biometric technology in the registration and authentication of voters has somewhat helped to counter voter fraud and enhance credibility of the election process. Though there still remain questions around the procurement and management of the biometric equipment, and also questions around the reliability of these devices, their introduction has helped to build some level of acceptability of the election voter lists and the final result. A second solution would be around sustainable financing of elections. Let's face it, running an election is very expensive, and for many African countries that have majority of their population living below the poverty line, there are issues of financing of the election. This has led to many African leaders to use the lack of financial resources as an excuse to either postpone or cancel elections. Many countries have also looked to international donors to fund their elections. Therefore, to have a credible system, it is important to develop sustainable ways to finance the elections. This could include establishing a national elections fund that runs over the presidential term limit, and this would be a sustainable way to finance the election. The last solution to explore would be around examining electoral laws, and especially those surrounding election disputes. In recent elections, such as in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Malawi, these countries have relied on their judicial systems to decide the electoral outcome. While there is nothing wrong with disgruntled politicians and parties going to court to dispute the election results, often there are a lot of loopholes in electoral laws that can be exploited. Resolving these flaws in the electoral laws would be an efficient way to end election-related violence in the African continent. So there you have it. That's my thought on the next chapter in African elections, and I would love to hear your thought on African elections. How can we end the pre- and post-election violence, and how can our governments do better to make their election outcomes more credible? And as always, thank you for watching. Feel free to subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss out on our future videos. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a thumbs up, and if you absolutely hated it, click on the thumbs down button twice just to be sure that you really hated it. Thank you for watching, and see you in our next video.